Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com, and we'd love to talk to you about hosting your telescope under our dark sky, or if you're interested in hourly rental of one of our telescopes, you can get in touch with us through the website. Again, that's utahdesertremote.com. Today I want to talk about a topic that was new to me until the other day, and that's continuum subtraction. We'll talk about what it is, why you might want to use it, and how I go about approximating the process using Photoshop. So this shows a more or less finished image, and if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I work in layers in Photoshop, and I preserve all the layers intact. So I do wind up with fairly large files. In this case it's around a 7 gigabyte file, so it's pretty large. But that gives me a lot of flexibility to go back and change and correct things. If I find a problem after the fact, I can go back and change it, or if I just change my mind about what I want it to look like. So this is an RGB, LRGB actually, plus HA image, and continuum subtraction becomes useful when working with narrowband data, and particularly blending narrowband in with galaxies, which is exactly the situation we have here. And let me pop over to PixInsight, and we'll talk a little bit about what continuum subtraction is and why you might want to use it. So this is just the RGB version. I have already run this data through WBPP, and it was around 20 hours worth of data, and to be real honest, I just kind of grabbed a whole folder full of files to assemble these. So I think there was some bad data in there. You'll see some of the stacking didn't work very well. That's all easily fixable in Photoshop, as you'll see. So this is the RGB image, red, green, and blue. And in my typical workflow, I'll combine R, G, and B, maybe do a quick dynamic background extraction, run spectrophotometric color calibration to get the right color of stars, stretch the image, and then I will remove the stars. And in this case I also boosted the saturation a little bit because it was looking pretty anemic, and then save that as a 16-bit TIFF, and this becomes our color data for the galaxy itself. I also have star data, and as I've started doing, I actually have two versions of the stars, a sharp version, so this is, and a fuzzy version. And that lets we can control the size and appearance of the stars very precisely with that. The luminance data is just what you would expect. It's the galaxy in just in luminance, and you can see there's some stacking artifacts down here where these were shot over a period of different times, and all of the frames didn't align. There's a little bit of IFN in the background, plus some smudges where stars were removed. Again, that's not a problem. We'll fix that in Photoshop. The hydrogen, though, if we look at the hydrogen data, you can see it actually is pretty bright. And this is after processing, so I have stretched the image and I have removed the stars. And we can see there's a lot of nebula data, but we also have this very bright core region where, even though it's a 3 nanometer hydrogen alpha filter, there is a lot of that HA signal coming from the stars that are glowing in the center of the galaxy. And what continuum subtraction is doing is, if you think of this as being kind of the continuous light that the tails or the wings of the band pass filter and the narrowband filter will still pick up, it's picking up HA beyond just the pure hydrogen alpha signal, and it's also picking up hydrogen alpha from places that we don't really want hydrogen alpha. We know there's a lot of hydrogen alpha here in the center, but the red, green, and blue really captured that just fine. And what we're really wanting to do is accentuate these nebula regions that are within the galaxy and outer arms, and not include this part in the center. And the secret to this is the HA picks up just a very narrow sliver of the red spectrum. The red filter actually picks up a fairly broad spectrum of the red wavelengths. That's why it's called broadband, because it's a broad band of reds. It's even a broader band when you include green and blue. And if we look at the red data, and again this is processed, you can see the red data doesn't really pick up too much of the nebula, a little bit, but it doesn't get a lot of the nebula, but it picks up a lot of this red broadband color throughout the galaxy, and it's especially bright here in the core. So what we want to do is use this red data from the red filter and subtract it from our hydrogen data, and what that will leave, if we do it right, it'll leave just these nebula regions more clearly defined without the confusion of the bright core. So that's what we're doing with continuum subtraction. We're going to subtract this image from this image to get just the HA. Now, the classical way of doing this, first of all, would be probably more correctly done with these files still in linear format. I, of course, have already stretched them, and that's because to work in Photoshop, it doesn't work very well with linear files. And secondly, I like to do it with starless images because I'll add the stars back in at the end. So this is kind of my version of approximating continuum subtraction, if you want to think of it that way. I'm not attempting to preserve the scientific value of the relative brightness of HA versus red versus any other element. I'm just trying to make a good-looking image that shows the structure of the HA nebula within the galaxy, but not necessarily a scientifically accurate version. So let's hop over into Photoshop and see how we do this. And just to give you a quick rundown of what we're headed towards, if you look at the layers palette over here on the right, and let's just turn everything off to start with. At the bottom of the layer stack, I have luminosity, and this is pretty much what we just looked at in PixInsight with all of its problems and warts and noise and dust motes and so forth. Next is the RGB data, and what that does, this RGB layer is just in color blending mode, so all it's adding is color. And I've got a mask on this layer group so that it's only letting the color data through where we want it. In fact, it looks like I could probably expand this. I'll just paint with white at 100% opacity and make sure we're getting color throughout this region and not just on the in the core. Again, another reason for working non-destructively with and preserving your Photoshop layers. So that's probably a little bit better version of that now. Turn the luminosity back on. Next is the HA, and this is where I've already applied the subtraction. And there you saw the HA kind of turn on. And next, I want to hide some of this data in the background. So I can make it darker and hide some of that. And then I can go even a step further, and I will add a solid fill layer here. In this solid fill layer, if we look at its value, it's set at roughly 19 red, green, and blue. So it's a very dark gray, not quite black, but very dark. And then I put this layer group in lighten blending mode. So what that does is anything that is darker than 19, 19, 19 gets lifted to that level. So I'm not sure, I'm missing something somewhere, because we want this to be more like that, so that we're getting just the luminosity. We're driving all this background to black, but we're not painting with black, we're painting on a soft light layer, so it darkens without obliterating. and then we can turn the stars back on, and that's kind of what our finished image looks like. So let's build this from scratch, and it'll probably wind up looking a little bit different, but that'll show you all the steps I go through for an LRGB+Ha with continuum subtraction. So the first thing I want to do is load all of my layers. So I'll go to Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and what this does is load these files as layers, and we just hit Browse, navigate to where the data is stored, and these are the files that I want. We have our star images, the RGB data, the hydrogen alpha, and then I also saved just the red data, so we have both red and hydrogen alpha. Click OK, that loads the list. Click OK again, and that actually loads the files as layers. First thing we'll do once we get everything loaded is do just a little bit of basic housekeeping to organize the layers, and then we'll start actually applying the individual layers. So you never know for sure what order they're going to load in. It turns out that the color layer, the RGB layer, loaded on top. So I'm going to put each one of these in a group. So with the layer selected, I tap Control G, that would be Command G on a Mac. Change the name to RGB. And all we want from this layer is color. So I'm going to put this in color blending mode. Next it looks like, and then I'm just going to turn it off for now. It looks like we have the stars next. So again, I'm going to select both of those star layers. Control G. Change the name to stars. And I'm going to put the fluffy stars on top of the sharp stars. And I'm going to put this fluffy star layer in lighten blending mode. So in effect what we have is we have the sharp stars, and then we have the fluffy surrounding nebula. Both of these were created with Star Exterminator using different settings, and I have another video that explains that. But I can now adjust the opacity of this fluffy layer to decide how fluffy do I want them to be, and it's hard to tell until you really get it on top of the data. So for now we'll just close this. Next we have our luminance. So again, Control G. I'm going to drop a levels adjustment layer here, darken the background, and probably even darken the midtones a little bit. That may be a little too dark. And we know we're going to want to hide some of this background that didn't go quite to black. For instance, here there's some star smudges. So I'm going to just add a blank layer. I'll put it in soft light blending mode, and that lets me darken or lighten by painting with either black or white at a relatively low opacity. So for instance, to hide this, I'll paint with black at 10% opacity, and I'll just start going over it, and usually you may have to sneak up on it a little bit and go over it a few times, and each time I click it's adding another 10%. And I think we've got another smudge here that we'll hide. And then I'm going to come up above everything but below the stars, and I'm just going to add a solid color layer, and this is where we'll set it at somewhere between 18 and 20 for the brightness level, and put it in lighten blending mode. So now we have a nice smooth background. If I turn that on and off, you can see it's brightening the dark background, but it's not affecting anything else. So that corrected a lot of the problems in the luminosity layer. So if we turn on the stars, and of course we want this group at the very top, and we want it in screen blending mode. And if I turn on the RGB color layer, so there we have our RGB layer. We have luminosity on the bottom. I should probably label this. Then we have RGB, and that actually should be below this solid fill layer that sets our background, and then the stars on top. And of course I could turn any one of these on or off individually to see the effect or to decide if I need to adjust it. The next thing I want to do is add the HA. So let's take a look at that. And I'm just going to turn everything off but these bottom two layers. So this is the red filter. This is the HA filter. And I'm just going to drop both of these into a layer group, and we'll label it HA. And eventually this is going to move up to just below the solid fill layer. In fact, let's just go ahead and move it up now. What we want to do is, as I said, we have the red layer on top and the HA layer right underneath it. These are both in the HA group. So whatever happens in this group will only affect what's in the group. And what I want to do to start with is just subtract the red from the HA. So to do that, we'll change the blending mode from normal to subtract. And that subtracted everything. So we need to adjust the brightness of this red layer. To do that, I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer right on top of it, and then use this far left icon on the properties panel to clip this levels adjustment layer to the layer right below it. So this levels is going to change the brightness of just the red that we're subtracting from the HA. In the PixInsight process, they used a factor sometimes called Q. It's basically a derived factor through trial and error to get the result that you want. What I do is use this levels that's clipped to the red and adjust its brightness. And as we adjust the brightness, it will subtract either more or less. So if we do, let's say something like that, what we've done now is subtract this red data from the HA, and that leaves just the HA itself. And that'll probably need to be brightened back up a little bit, so I'll add another levels adjustment layer, which I'm going to leave this unclipped, and we can brighten the highlights. And now we'll put this layer into screen blending mode. And I'm going to double click here to the right of the layer name, or actually the layer group name, and that'll bring up the blending options dialog box or the layer style. And this is the blending options tab. And since we want our hydrogen to be red, we'll just turn off green and blue. And now we have red hydrogen with the continuum red subtracted. So we have just the nebula regions. So if I turn my RGB and luminosity back on, now we have just the HA nebula showing through because we have subtracted all this other stuff and kept just the part that we're most interested in. I'll turn our black background back on to smooth that out, turn the stars back on, and now I can judge, do I want the stars to be bigger, smaller? If I want them to be bigger, I just increase the opacity of this fluffy stars layer. If I want them smaller, I can reduce the opacity. And usually somewhere in the middle, depending on the image, and this is just done to taste, will give you something that feels about right. So that's a quick walkthrough of assembling an LRGB+HA image of a galaxy and using continuum subtraction to remove some of that HA data that was collected through the HA filter that isn't really nebula, it's just kind of a part of the continuous red tone that's present in the galaxy, and that gives us a much cleaner image. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments below. If you like content like this, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you click the bell for notifications, you'll get notified when there's a new video. And I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.